The world economy is splintering into rival blocs, a structural fracture that could define global power for decades. The US and China now lead competing spheres, pulling nations into a new era where alignment is no longer ideological, but enforced by dependency, security guarantees, and technology control. Who wins that race may determine whether the next global order is stable or consumed by mistrust and miscalculation. And in conflict zones across the world, a new model of peace is taking hold, a model that rewards aggression and punishes victims. From Gaza to Nagorno-Karabakh, Washington's vision of peace now privileges control over justice, facilitating ethnic cleansing while calling it progress. Power is being redistributed and accountability is being erased. I'm Hala Al-Hamalawi. This is In Focus. The global economic system is not collapsing, it is realigning. Neil Shearing's The Fractured Age argues that globalization is shifting from one interconnected marketplace to two competing power blocs. A US-aligned world economically stronger, tech-dominated, but politically unpredictable under Trump's multipolar hostility to allies. A China-aligned world, growing influence over supply chains and critical minerals, yet constrained by mistrust and capital controls. For the first time since the Cold War, states may be forced to choose security with Washington or development with Beijing. Powerful middle states, India, Turkey, Brazil, South Africa, no longer want to be junior players. They want leverage. The contest is not only economic, it is existential. Joining us is Mr. Maher Nicholas Frizzley, Director of the EU ASEAN Center, to shed more light on this very important issue. Mr. Frizzley, a very good day to you. Now, does the fragmentation of the global economy inevitably lead to a fragmentation of security and possibly conflicts?
I'm delighted to join you today from Holborn.
Always a pleasure.
It's a very complicated question. So the reason
it's a complicated issue.
Exactly. So in your question, topics are being mixed. You know, on the one hand, you have national security, military issues. On the other hand, you know, finance, trade, the economy. And in the old days, which would be 9 months ago, so 9 months ago, that question may have seemed strange, but today the question is perfectly normal because the world changed completely and dramatically just in the past 8 months. Why?
Because Donald Trump took office.
Well, but the second Trump presidency is very different from the first one, because what happened in the past 8 years, he got rid of the country club Republican and neocon Republican inside his own party. He completely eliminated them. You have very few old-fashioned Republican or neocon Republican left on Capitol Hill. Most are pro-Trump, and they are very different from their predecessors because they are industrial nationalists. And here the key word is not nationalism, it's industry. So Trump wants to reindustrialize America quickly. Why quickly? It's a race against the clock, because if we slice and dice, broad brush, the whole world economy in 9 or 10 big sectors, China is way ahead of America in 7 out of 10 sectors, which is really incredible. And the only sectors where America is still ahead of the curve, but not much, are aviation, both military and civilian aviation. AI is another sector where America is ahead, and microchip, where America is ahead together with its allies, South Korea and Taiwan, right? So America could not be ahead of China in microchips if it did not have the full support and backing of, South Korea, Taiwan, and Holland. And so that's only three sectors. In all other sectors, civil engineering, construction, energy, renewable energy, transportation, high-speed rail, trains, car, automobile, trucks, China is way ahead of America and Europe. So it's a wake-up call for America, and it's a fight for survival.
Yes. Well, many analysts say that U.S. allies are its greatest strength, as you just said. But if Trump undermines trust, do those allies drift towards a non-aligned future?
Here, I would disagree with the majority view. Right? So the majority view in America, actually, in America, most economic, financial, and geopolitical experts, be they Democrats or Republican, and I think, neocon, pro-Bush Republican, you still have a lot of neocon, pro-Bush, pro-Dick Cheney Republicans in the media, Fox News or Newsweek, but whatever. So the left-wing Democrats, they hate Trump, and the right-wing Republican, pro-free market don't like him. So they're saying that he's mistreating, for example, Germany, France, India, and the EU Commission. And actually, the EU Commission, Germany, France are not relevant. So in this new era, age of geoeconomics, France, Germany, the EU Commission, they have nothing much to bring to America. And even India doesn't have a lot to bring to America. So there are a few countries in Europe, like Holland, like Switzerland, who can bring something to the table to the Americans, and maybe Ireland, right? So if you remove, Ireland, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and Holland, the American industrial nationalist intellectuals and policy planners don't care much about Europe. And Europe, the Germans and the French, they put themselves in a corner. Why did Europe put itself in a corner? Because instead of remaining neutral, so in that Chinese-American rivalry, because if Europe had remained neutral, it would have given the Europeans something called leverage. And without leverage, you cannot negotiate, neither with your enemies nor with your friends. So the Europeans, because they're not very intelligent, Emmanuel Macron and Ursula von der Leyen and Friedrich Merz, what did they do in the past year? They have insulted China. They have attacked China aggressively, saying that China is an enemy, that China is a dictatorship, silly, unconstructive commentaries, right? And even, the Dutch government, they tried to nationalize an advanced microchip company in Amsterdam owned by a Chinese company. And it backfired against them. What I'm coming at, they're making many mistakes. The biggest mistake is to insult the Chinese and the Russians, because if you insult China and Russia, what does Trump say? These guys have cut the bridges, they have burned, like Tariq bin Ziyad, right? Like Tariq bin Ziyad, Gibraltar, right? So what Gibraltar, Tariq bin Ziyad, what he did when he crossed from Morocco to Spain, he burned the bridges.
No turning back, in a nutshell.
The Europeans, they burned their bridges with Russia and with China, which is even more risky. And so America says, these imbeciles, they've burned the bridges with Beijing. Therefore, even if we mistreat them, even if we treat the Germans and the French very harshly, they cannot turn to China and get leverage.
Well, speaking of China, and since you mentioned that China is ahead in 7 out of 10 cases, can China maintain economic influence without financial openness or political reform, or will capital fear eventually shatter Beijing's ascent?
So, political reform is not very important. What's important in that game is efficiency. So if there is, sometimes when you have an authoritarian regimes, not always, but sometimes if the regime is very centralized and very authoritarian, which is obviously the case of the Chinese Politburo. So the leading force is called the Standing Committee of the Politburo of the Chinese Communist Party. It's a small elite, right? So if that small elite is too authoritarian and maybe a little bit corrupt, which can be the case marginally, then it can be a problem over time. But it doesn't mean that democracies, liberal democracies, it doesn't mean they are more efficient or less corrupt than China. You have as many, if not more, corruption scandals in Germany, France, Britain than in Shanghai or Beijing. So the issue is not democracy. The issue is efficiency and keeping the people happy. That is the issue. And even if you're a democracy, so today in France, less than 12% of French voters are happy with Emmanuel Macron. It's a democracy. In Britain, less than 20% of British voters are happy with the government of Keir Starmer. So the issue is not elections or democracy. The issue is keeping the middle class and the working class happy. That's the issue, and growing the economy. And here the performance of the Chinese Standing Committee of the Politburo is quite good, because the Chinese, the standard of living of the Chinese working class and middle class keeps on rising. Now it's not rising as fast as 10 years ago, so there is a slowdown, but it's rising and the economy is rising. So the performance is much better, let's say, than the EU. Today, the GDP growth in England, Britain, France, and Germany is 0.1%. When the economy grows at plus 0.1, plus 0.2% annualized, it is a disaster, because it means that the middle class, the working class, their standard of living will collapse.
Exactly. Are middle powers now the true kingmakers, forcing a multipolar world neither Washington nor Beijing fully controls?
It will take time. So, it's an old idea. It's a beautiful idea, actually, philosophically and politically. The third way. So, the global south, the Arab world, Asia, Latin America, Africa, is about a third way. So, you don't have to take sides. You don't have to be pro-Chinese or pro-American. If you are Brazilian or Egyptian or Saudi Arabian, you can have your own way, right? And even President Gamal Abdel Nasser, in his early speeches, this is exactly what he said, right? In the 50s, it was called the non-aligned movement, Adam Diaz. And Adam Diaz was about that. But it's easier said than done. So it's easy to say that Brazil and Russia and Turkey and Malaysia, blah, blah, blah. But it's a long road. It will take 15, 20, 30 more years, right? And
yes, but when it comes to Africa and Latin America, does Africa and Latin America's mineral and demographic power give them a decisive role in shaping which bloc prevails?
It could. So that image is that of the two gods, the two gods, or the two giants. So the Chinese dragon and the American eagle are like gigantic gods, and they are fighting each other. And sometimes when you are small, you're only human, but you can tip the balance. So if the human being tips the balance on one side...
This is a very mythical description.
Right? It's a Greek mythology.
Yes.
And I think that image from Greek mythology is very telling. To a certain extent, it's true, because rare earth minerals, let's say 70% approximately, are in China, 15% are in Russia, including Siberia, and then 15-20% are in the rest of the world, including Venezuela, Mexico, Algeria, Egypt, etc. But it will take time, because, for example, you need to extract the physical minerals from the soil. You need to create new mines, and building, digging and setting up a new operational mines take 2-3 years. Then you need to refine it. And 95% of the world's refining capacity for rare earth minerals is in China. So it's a long road. Yes, it may tilt the scale, but it will take time.
Briefly, Mr. Fursley, ultimately, who abandons their follies? First, a protectionist U.S. risking credibility, or a rigid China sacrificing growth for control?
So here, he who terms the debate, so he who describes the issue, controls the narrative. It's called framing, framing the debate.
Yes, it's a well-known media theory.
Exactly. So most people, most experts, most economists in Europe and America, be they conservative or left-wing or socialist, they hate Trump, right? And so they describe him as protectionist. Protectionist is a very negative word, right? Because protectionist in economics nearly means idiot, right? Or that guy, because when you say protectionist, you think of what? Albania under Enver Hoxha. So Enver Hoxha was a communist, extreme communist, stupid dictator. And the ideal of Albania under Comrade Enver Hoxha was autarkia, extreme protectionism. So when you say that, you're almost saying the guy is an imbecile. So what he's trying to do is not protectionism, he's trying to re-industrialize. So the key word here is re-industrialization. So bringing factories away from Germany, away from China, away from Vietnam and Cambodia to Texas, Minnesota, Oklahoma. And to some extent, it's too early to judge, but to some extent, Trump is winning because look at what's happening. South Korea and Singapore and Germany are already transferring giant factories. They're building now, the South Koreans, the Singaporeans, the Germans, giant factories, not in Europe or Asia. They are building them in America. So already it's the beginning of a victory for Trump.
Yes. Well, I'd like to thank you so much, Mr. Fersley. Well, the world is not deglobalizing. It is sorting itself into rival futures, and no country is safe from the consequences. From fractured economics to peace built on the ashes of accountability. The foreign policy warns of a new U.S.-led approach to peace, one where the perpetrator decides the terms. Nagorno-Karabakh is now emptied of Armenians, expelled by blockade, starvation, and assault. Yet Azerbaijan could be given a peacekeeping role in Gaza, a region suffering accusations of ethnic cleansing by Israel. This is not diplomacy, this is the normalization of force. Trump's conflict resolution model: recognize the victor, ignore the victim, call it peace. Peace wishing replaces justice. International humanitarian law becomes optional. If this becomes the standard, the world's most vulnerable populations lose all protection. Now we're joined by Mr. Brent Sadler, retired U.S. Navy captain and former military diplomat. Welcome to Qnews, sir. Does rewarding force signal to aggressors worldwide that the quickest route to legitimacy is ethnic cleansing?
Well, I think it matters which incident or crisis that we're talking about. You mentioned in your opening monologue Nagorno-Karabakh, which goes back to the late days of the Soviet Union as it was falling apart. And I would say Armenia's loss of the most recent war in 2020, longstanding war against Azerbaijan, is largely due to their own fault. They picked a bad choice, an ally in Moscow, in Russia. And at the time they were, in 2020, the Russians were gearing up for what would become the invasion of Ukraine, and they had their hands full elsewhere, and certainly were not committed to pushing back on Azerbaijan. So it was a bad choice of ally. They also did not pace the threat. The Azerbaijanis had done their homework. They had advanced in drone technology, and they built a military that was, designed to focus in on the weaknesses of the Armenians. And so if you're not responsible in your own defense, you suffer the consequences. And I think that's the sad reality of the lesson to take for other countries. Not that, an aggressor is being rewarded, but again, when greater powers come in to try to reestablish peace, it's always for their national self-interest also.
Yeah, so if I understand correct, the perspective from Gaza to Nagorno-Karabakh are different. But if we look at Gaza and Nagorno-Karabakh, what are the dangers of exporting the same victor's peace model to both regions?
Well, again, it comes back to the reality on the ground. If you had a group, in the case of Gaza, the fighting, if you just look at the trigger for the current war that's still being fought right now in Gaza between Hamas and Israel, that war was started by the attack of October 7th. And step aside from the historical, just on the conflict part of it, Hamas started a war, they lost that war, and now they're paying the consequences of waging a very flawed military operation, which they had in the early days the potential of a huge military success, but they let it devolve into bloodlust. They could have been better pursued if they had moved away from this hatred into something a little bit more realist in their pursuits. And so, quite frankly, they're suffering defeat, and that's at their own choice.
And can the international system survive if accountability and human rights are removed from peace negotiations? Because we must admit that the losses of the Palestinian lives here, if we're talking about Gaza, are numerous.
Absolutely. I think the first thing is when you're looking at who brought about this death and destruction on the Palestinian people in Gaza, I blame Hamas first and foremost. Again, looking at the context of the violence that was begun, the cycle of violence begun on October 7th, it's clear that Hamas was not, and certainly not, to the benefit of the Palestinian people. And so hopefully, when we're trying to look forward, Hamas needs to be removed from any future decision and governance in Gaza. And hopefully the focus, and I think there's a lot of indications in the peace agreements that are being pushed right now by many in the Middle East, as well as the United States and Israel, is to focus in on security, both for the Israelis, but also for the Palestinians, and for a better, more prosperous future. That focusing in on it that way, it's more likely to have a positive outcome rather than trying to focus in on victor and defeated and trying to go after justice in this
What
case.
about accountability, sir? What about accountability?
Well, hopefully Hamas's leadership, enough of them are survived to be brought before.
What about accountability on the part of Israel?
I think that's also happening.
Happening in what way? Because Israel continues to violate the ceasefire so far.
Well, I mean, again, this goes back to Hamas has also been accused of violating the ceasefire as well.
Violations are taking place, sir, in the West Bank, for example, and other parts in the Palestinian territories other than Gaza.
Well, we're focused on the Gaza and Hamas. It's clear that the Hamas is not living up to the obligations. And again, I go back to Hamas agreed to put down their weapons and to leave Gaza by reasserting their power and then also attacking Israeli forces. They're violating the terms of the treaty. Perhaps there's violations on the Israeli side. That is not on the record here in Washington, D.C. So I can't speak to anything unless you give specific cases. As far as the West Bank, that's a different group. Hamas is present there as well. But again, you have the Palestinian Authority, and trying to do better for the Palestinian people is the goal. It's also a strong case to be made that the Palestinian Authority is not speaking for the better future of the Palestinian people also.
Do you think that the U.S. Surrendering the moral authority that once defined its diplomacy, who fills that vacuum?
Well, moral superiority is what's gotten us into many of these very violent wars in the past and so-called nation building. There's no political appetite for nation building. Doesn't mean the United States ceases to be a moral or a democratic society, far from it, but we certainly focus more on taking care of our own people first before we start trying to impress upon others. There's certainly no appetite for so-called forever wars, for higher moralistic ends, because no one really benefits unless the people in the receiving end of that want it.
Sir, does this model entrench permanent instability where oppressed populations see violence as the only alternative?
I don't think so. Again, you have to look at specific places. I think one case to look at to apply the same type of test is what's been happening in Nigeria. The Boko Haram, a radical religious group that's been pretty much ineffectively suppressed or attacked by the government there to prevent the persecution and the widespread killing of Christians for many years. So how can a better governance, a better approach to securing stability and governance in that country be done so that people of all religious groups can live peacefully side by side? It is a deeper question, and again, it has to be answered in the context of each place.
Well,
what happens in Gaza, very different than Nigeria.
Yeah, yes. Since you mentioned Nigeria, sir, there are reports that President Donald Trump threatened to invade Nigeria or interfere militarily on a military basis. How would you comment on that?
Well, I don't know how serious that was, but certainly there is a dissatisfaction in the White House for what has been a decades-long war against Christians in Nigeria that the government there's been for a host of reasons, not because of lack of intent always, but certainly they just have not been effective at pushing back against Boko Haram. And that group has killed all groups, not just Christians, but also Muslims that are also getting in the way of its radical view of the world. And I think that's the real threat, is this radical extremist view being imposed on people, and trying to help those governments that address the needs of the people for a better economic, but also a more open society at the same time.
When conflict becomes a business model with reconstruction profits guaranteed, who has incentive to ever stop the war?
Well, I mean, it's both sides of the equation. Unfortunately, you've got those that may profit from conflict and arms sales. Again, that's kind of a losing proposition because wars are costly and they cannot be sustained when you're talking about major wars like what's happening in Ukraine right now.
Yes.
One could make the case that China's profiteering. One can make the case that NATO countries are profiteering, or the United States. The reality is it only can last as long as there's Ukrainians and Russians to fight that war. So that side of the equation self-corrects itself in a very sad way. But on the other side, reconstruction and NGOs involved in peacekeeping or providing services also benefit not from solving the disasters of warfare or interscene rivalry and insurgencies. Quite the contrary, they continue to profit by the progression of the propagation of these types of disgruntled groups that are constantly at each other and not trying to work to where groups, rival groups, can live peacefully side by side. So you have to deal with both sides of the equation.
Yes. Speaking of Europe, European leaders have criticized the U.S. plan as favoring Russia and demanded their inclusion in talks. Does Russia see Europe's push as interference, and how might Moscow respond if European influence increases in the final agreement?
Yeah, the European countries have little voice or say in this, quite frankly, because they have very little militarily to put in. They have some economic, but they continue to buy and rely on Russian oil too often, despite the years of this war is going on. So there's not a lot of credibility there, both for the European countries that you're hearing from, like France, in Moscow, nor in Kyiv, quite frankly. There's only 3 parties that matter in this ceasefire agreement and that'll actually get the fighting stopped. 1 is Moscow, 2 is Kyiv, and number 3 is Washington, D.C., with a very strong and substantial military power behind it. That's what Putin respects, quite frankly.
Mm-hmm. If might makes right again, are we heading towards an era where genocidal outcomes become diplomatically irreversible?
Well, I think what we are moving back into is what the Chinese Communist Party has been trying to build in. That's a multipolar world. And in that, it's a world filled with realists because you act on your national self-interest. There's no room for moralistic grandstanding. It's about securing your people's security and your economic viability. And so I think it becomes very clear and it becomes very easy to execute diplomacy in this world. It doesn't mean it's going to be any more peaceful, but it's going to be a lot more clear where people's interests begin and end.
Well, thank you so much, Captain Sadler. Thank you so much for your valuable input. From a world divided into rival blocs to a peace system that favors the strong over the just, the danger is not only conflict, but actually who gets to define its end. This has been In Focus. I'm Hala Al-Hamalawi. Thank you so much for joining us. Good night.